The morning watch on the USS Essex had only just started when aviation ordnance man first class Tommy McKenna noticed something that would stay with him forever. It was February 17, 1944, and the pre-dawn gloom over the Central Pacific hid what was becoming the greatest concentration of naval striking power the world had ever seen. Task Force 58, led by Admiral Raymond Spruant and Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, was closing on Truk Lagoon with 15 aircraft carriers, 7 battleships, and more than 900 combat aircraft. Yet McKenna's attention that instant was fixed not on the vast spread of American might along the horizon, but on the face of Seaman Second-class Jerry Nakamura, a Japanese-American sailor from Hawaii. As Jerry translated intercepted radio chatter in the Combat Information Center, tears ran down his face. "They don't know we're coming," he whispered, his voice breaking as he parsed the casual exchanges between Japanese air controllers across the Caroline Islands. "They're talking about mail runs and movie nights. They have no idea." McKenna later said that in that moment, he grasped the full scale of what was about to happen. Not merely another raid or another island taken in the brutal Pacific campaign, but the instant when American naval aviation would display a potency so overwhelming it would overturn centuries of assumptions about naval warfare. The Essex-class carriers in Task Force 58 were poised to show that the era of the battleship had ended and that a new kind of war, measured not by the reach of heavy guns but by the relentless launch and recovery of aircraft from decks that never slept, would decide the fate of nations. 6 months earlier, the Central Pacific had been under Japanese control. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's defensive ring stretched from the Aleutian Islands in the north to the Solomon Islands in the south, anchored by the seemingly impregnable fortress of Truk Lagoon in the Caroline Islands. The combined fleet used Truk as a forward base, a vast network of anchorages, airfields, and supply depots American intelligence had nicknamed the Gibraltar of the Pacific. From Truk, Japanese naval and air forces could strike at any Allied push across the Central Pacific, shielding the critical sea lanes that linked the resource-rich southern areas to the Japanese home islands. The Japanese plan was simple and elegant: an outer ring of fortified atolls, Gilbert, Marshall, and Caroline Islands, would act as unsinkable aircraft carriers, their coral runways and concealed gun emplacements making any American approach enormously costly. Japanese strategists believed that even if the Americans could assemble the naval power to attack these positions, the casualties would be so heavy that U.S. public opinion would force a negotiated settlement. They pointed to Tarawa, where 1,090 Marines died and 21,101 were wounded in 3 days of fighting to seize a coral atoll no larger than the National Mall in Washington, D.C. If that was the cost for a single atoll, what would it take to push through hundreds of similar strongholds toward Japan? Yet the Japanese had badly misread the situation. They underestimated the vast scale of American industrial capability and failed to foresee the revolutionary shifts in naval aviation being forged in the shipyards of Newport News, Brooklyn, and Norfolk. The Essex-class carriers that began entering service in late 1943 were more than bigger decks and more aircraft. They embodied a fundamental change in naval power. Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell, Air Group Commander aboard the USS Essex, understood that change better than most, standing on the flight deck in the pre-dawn hours of February 17th. Watching final strike preparations for Truk, he felt the steady vibration of the ship's machinery beneath his boots, massive steam turbines producing 120,000 horsepower that pushed the Essex and her sisters beyond 30 knots. Speed was part of it, but the true revolution lay in sustaining relentless flight operations day and night. "The Japanese think of carriers the way they think of battleships," McCampbell had told his squadron commanders at the final briefing. "They view them as platforms for one decisive strike. We are not that. We are factories. We manufacture destruction on an industrial scale, and we don't stop." The figures proved the point. Each Essex-class carrier could cycle aircraft continuously. The ship's 2 elevators moved planes from hangar to flight deck in 90 seconds. The pair of steam catapults could send off a fully loaded Grumman F-6F Hellcat or Douglas SBD Dauntless roughly every 30 seconds, And crucially, these carriers were meant to operate as integrated task groups, 3 or 4 carriers supporting one another in circular formations under the protection of fast battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Admiral Mark Mitcher had refined this concept during the Marshall Islands campaign in January 1944. Task Force 58 had shown at Kwajalein and Majuro that American carriers could sustain continuous air operations for weeks, launching wave after wave of strikes while providing fleet air defense and close air support for amphibious landings. The Japanese had never encountered anything like it because nothing like it had existed before. Admiral Chuchin Nagumo, once celebrated for Pearl Harbor and now commanding the Central Pacific Area Fleet from Saipan, watched the Marshall Islands' devastation with growing unease. The American advance was blisteringly fast. Kwajalein Atoll, fortified for 2 years and defended by 8,500 troops, fell in 4 days. The 4th Marine Division and the 7th Infantry Division had used lessons from Tarawa to hone their amphibious methods. What truly unnerved Nagumo, however, was American naval aviation's role. Essex-class carriers maintained constant air cover through the Marshall Islands campaign, flying over 2,000 sorties in support of the landings. F-6F Hellcats cleared Japanese planes from the skies over Roy Namur and Kwajalein, while SBD Dauntless dive bombers and TBF Avenger torpedo bombers methodically wrecked every Japanese installation on captured atolls. Most alarming to the Japanese was how sustainable these operations were. Japanese doctrine favored concentrating all aircraft for a single, decisive strike. The Americans, by contrast, could press continuous strikes for days. They operate their carriers like we operate our airfields. Commander Ryanosuke Kasaka, Nagumo's chief of staff, wrote in a classified assessment to Combined Fleet Headquarters in February 1944. But their airfields can move at 30 knots and are backed by battleships. We have no answer for this. Kasaka's warning would prove true. As Task Force 58 closed on Truk Lagoon in the early morning of February 17th, the Japanese combined fleet was about to learn that its greatest stronghold had become a trap. The first sign of trouble came at 05:30, when radar operators at Truk Perm Airfield spotted a large group of aircraft approaching from the east. Lieutenant Jiro Tanaka, duty officer at the Truk Air Control Center, initially chalked the contacts up to navigational error. American carriers were known to be operating around the Marshalls, more than 700 miles away, and no carrier-based plane should have the range to hit Truk and return. But at 06:15, as the sun climbed over the Caroline Islands, 72 Grumman F-6F Hellcats from Task Force 58 skimmed over Truk's northern airfields at treetop height. The fighters came from air groups aboard the USS Enterprise, USS Yorktown, USS Essex, USS Intrepid, and USS Bunker Hill, and were supported by light carriers USS Belleau Wood, USS Katsuya, USS Monterey, and USS Cowpens. This was the largest carrier strike force ever assembled, and it had slipped in undetected by keeping strict radio silence and staying beyond Japanese reconnaissance range. The Japanese reaction was immediate but chaotic. About 80 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters scrambled from Truk's 3 operational airfields, but faced serious handicaps. The American Hellcats enjoyed both altitude and speed advantages over the lighter Japanese fighters. Many Japanese pilots were inexperienced replacements hastily trained after veteran losses over Rabaul and Bougainville. Most crucially, the Americans had complete tactical surprise. N.S. Roy, a Hellcat pilot from the USS Lexington, would later describe the air battle over Truk as the most one-sided fight he had ever seen. The American fighters had climbed to 25,000 feet on approach, giving them the energy and altitude advantage as they dove on the rising Japanese formations. The F-6F Hellcat, powered by a 2,000-horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial engine, could dive faster than the Zero while retaining better control at high speed. Even more significant was the Hellcat's rugged construction and self-sealing fuel tanks, which let it take hits that would have destroyed a Japanese fighter. Within 2 hours, 50 Japanese planes had been shot down while the Americans lost only 4 Hellcats. Yet the aerial clash was only the opening maneuver. As the fighter sweep cleared Truk's skies, another wave of American aircraft approached the lagoon. SBD Dauntless dive bombers, TBF Avenger torpedo bombers, and F-4U Corsair fighter bombers launched from the 9 carriers of Task Force 58. Their objective was the shipping anchored inside Truk Lagoon, and what they discovered surpassed even the brightest estimates from U.S. intelligence. The lagoon held the remnants of the Japanese combined fleet: battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and over 30 auxiliary vessels such as tankers, transports, and repair ships. Admiral Minachi Koga, who had taken command of the combined fleet after Yamamoto, had ordered many of the heavy units to fall back to Palau when American reconnaissance was detected on February 4th. But the support vessels had stayed, their holds crammed with fuel, munitions, and supplies meant to sustain Japanese operations across the Central Pacific. Lieutenant Frank Lawler, flying an SBD Dauntless from the USS Enterprise, picked out the largest target he could find: the submarine tender Rio de Janeiro Maru, a converted passenger liner serving as a floating repair depot for Japanese subs. Anchored amid smaller craft, the 461-foot ship took Lawler's 1,000-pound bomb amidships. The projectile punched through several decks and detonated in the engine room. The Rio de Janeiro Maru settled by the stern and sank within minutes, carrying with her the spare parts and technical gear critical to Japanese submarine work in the region. Comparable scenes unfolded throughout the lagoon as American dive bombers and torpedo aircraft methodically wrecked the logistics network that had kept Japanese naval operations running for 2 years. A light cruiser attempting escape through the northern pass was caught and sunk with all hands by torpedo planes from the USS Intrepid. Destroyers Maki and Noaki, their crews scrambling to raise steam, were overwhelmed by coordinated multi-squadron attacks. By noon on February 17th, more than 20 Japanese vessels had been sunk or damaged beyond repair. The decisive change brought by American naval airpower, however, was not merely the destruction on day 1, but the fact that it continued unbroken into a second and third day. The Essex-class carriers sustained non-stop flight operations during the Truk attack, launching waves of strikes while recovering damaged aircraft and rearming returning planes. This was a deck cycle with no pause, a level of coordination and stamina Japan's naval air arm could not match. Aviation Chief Petty Officer Hiroshi Suzuki, assigned to the light carrier Chitose at Truk, watched the American onslaught from a vantage that made him keenly aware of both sides' methods. Suzuki had been a naval aviator for 15 years, taking part in Pearl Harbor and early campaigns in the Dutch East Indies. He knew carrier operations intimately, and what he saw convinced him the war was lost for Japan. "Our doctrine is to mass all available aircraft in a single attack," he wrote in his diary on the evening of February 17th. "We launch everything at once, surprise the enemy, inflict maximum damage, and withdraw. The Americans do not withdraw. They return and hit again and again. Their carriers are like airfields that move and are shielded by the mightiest fleet ever assembled." Surviving Japanese staff officers at Truk later confirmed Suzuki's impression. The American carriers had maintained continuous air operations for 48 hours, mounting more than 1,200 combat sorties across the Caroline Islands. The logistical burden was enormous. An Essex-class carrier carried roughly 90 aircraft, consuming hundreds of tons of aviation gasoline, thousands of rounds of ammunition, and hundreds of bombs and torpedoes. Sustaining that tempo at sea was a revolution in naval logistics Japan could not match. The secret was not only the carrier's size, but their design philosophy. Where Japanese carriers emphasized aircraft numbers over endurance and survivability, the Essex-class was built to keep fighting for extended periods. Their ammunition handling systems could move ordnance from magazines to the flight deck in minutes. Their aviation gasoline storage and distribution allowed refueling of entire air groups without stopping flight operations. And their damage control arrangements and armor let them absorb hits and keep working. That resilience would be proven time and again in 1944-45. The USS Franklin survived 2 major kamikaze strikes, one of which penetrated the flight deck and detonated in the hangar, killing more than 700 men. The USS Bunker Hill suffered similar damage, yet remained operational. Not a single Essex-class carrier was sunk during the war despite repeated attacks by enemy aircraft, submarines, and suicide planes. That survivability changed operational calculus. Task force commanders could accept risks that would have been suicidal for more delicate ships. Admiral Mark Mitcher's aggressive doctrine let Task Force 58 operate deep inside Japan's defensive ring and strike targets once thought unreachable. The destruction at Truk Lagoon clarified this new reality. On February 18th, the second day of Operation Hailstone, American carrier aircraft sank another 27 Japanese vessels and finished off ships damaged the day before. The operation's final toll included 12 warships, 32 merchant vessels, and 275 aircraft. And more than 140,000 tons of Japanese shipping rested on the lagoon floor, along with fuel, ammunition, and supplies meant to sustain Central Pacific operations. Strategically, the raid's effects went beyond the immediate wreckage. Deprived of its forward base, the Japanese combined fleet withdrew to Western Pacific ports beyond the reach of American land-based aircraft, and also beyond effective range to support operations in the Marshalls and Gilberts. That geographic displacement proved decisive in later battles, leaving Japanese naval forces unable to support defenders in the Marianas and elsewhere. The Truk victory also validated the Central Pacific Campaign's strategic idea. Instead of slugging through heavily fortified positions in costly frontal assaults, Admiral Chester Nimitz's forces could use superior mobility and strike power to neutralize key strong points and bypass others. This island-hopping approach cut American casualties and sped the advance toward Japan. The groundwork for that strategy had been laid 3 months earlier in the Gilbert Islands, where U.S. forces first demonstrated the combination of carrier aviation, amphibious assault, and rapid airfield construction that would define the Central Pacific Campaign. The assault on Tarawa Atoll in November 1943 had been a bitter, costly lesson in the realities of amphibious assaults against prepared defenses. The 2nd Marine Division suffered more than 3,000 casualties taking Baitio Island, a coral atoll scarcely 300 acres in size. But the hard-earned lessons from Tarawa reshaped American amphibious doctrine and enabled the fast advances that followed. Chief among those lessons was the vital importance of advanced base construction. Within hours of securing Baitio, Navy Construction Battalion 74, the Seabees, began transforming the captured Japanese airfield into an American base. Working under near-constant threat of air attack and battling coral and debris, the Seabees had the field operational within 15 hours of organized resistance ending. That feat, replicated across the Central Pacific Campaign, proved as crucial as victories by Marines or Navy aviators. Construction Battalion Chief William Big Bill Morrison had been a civilian contractor in Hawaii before the war, building runways and hangars for Army and Navy airfields protecting approaches to Pearl Harbor. He watched from his headquarters roof on December 7, 1941, as Nakajima B-5N torpedo planes swept over Ford Island and devastated the Pacific Fleet. The image of battleships capsizing in Pearl Harbor convinced him the battleship's dominance was waning. It took 2 years of war for him to see what would replace it, and the answer became clear during the Kwajalein Atoll assault in February 1944. Morrison's unit, the 121st Naval Construction Battalion, went ashore with the 4th Marine Division on Roy Island on February 1st. The pre-invasion bombardment had been more effective than anything attempted before. Task Force 58's carriers and the Pacific Fleet's fast battleships had poured concentrated fire onto the island for 3 days before the Marines hit the beach. When the first wave of amphibious tractors crossed the lagoon reef, they found Japanese defenses largely shattered and the defenders broken by the relentless bombing and shelling. "We went from ship to shore to an operational airfield in 60 hours, Morrison later told his superiors, a process that included clearing wreckage from Japanese installations, grading and surfacing a 4,300-foot runway, installing fuel distribution systems, and building facilities capable of supporting a full fighter squadron. The Japanese had spent 2 years turning Roy into a strong point. The Americans turned it into an airbase in under 3 days. The rapid pace of American base construction had strategic consequences that went well beyond the immediate tactical benefit of forward airfields. Each captured atoll became both a stepping stone for the next assault and a node in an expanding American air network that could support operations across the Central Pacific. B-24 Liberators based at Tarawa could reach targets in the Marshalls. B-25 Mitchells operating from Kwajalein could back up strikes in the Carolines. As the U.S. advance created its own logistics and support infrastructure, it simultaneously dismantled Japan's. Tokyo's response was hampered by basic limits in industrial output and doctrine. Japan had begun the war with advantages in aircraft design and highly skilled naval aviators. But its industries could not replace losses quickly enough, and the training pipeline could not produce well-prepared pilots at the pace required. Commander Minoru Genda, the planner of the Pearl Harbor strike, and by then a staff officer with the combined fleet, spelled out the crisis in a confidential report to Admiral Koga in March 1944. The enemy had developed industrial and operational capacities Japan could not match. Genda warned that American Essex-class carriers were larger, faster, and more survivable, that U.S. pilots trained longer and flew more advanced machines, and, most ominously, that American logistics let them sustain high-tempo operations indefinitely, while Japanese forces grew ever more constrained by fuel and ammunition shortages. Genda's assessment was grimly accurate. Japanese carriers optimized for speed and aircraft capacity lacked the armor and damage control systems that let American ships remain effective under fire. Japanese air crews, while individually capable, saw less flight time in training because of fuel shortages and the urgent need to replace combat losses. Above all, Japan's logistics were collapsing under U.S. submarine attacks and the ever greater distances supplies had to travel. The submarine campaign ran alongside surface operations and proved equally lethal. From advanced bases in the Marshalls and supported by ultra-intelligence, American submarines were systematically cutting the merchant lines that bound Japan's empire. The toll was catastrophic. U.S. submarines sank 335 Japanese merchant ships in 1943 and 603 in 1944, totaling more than 3 million tons. The USS Seahorse, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Slade Cutter, typified the aggressive undersea offensive strangling Japanese supply. Operating out of Pearl Harbor and later from the newly taken base at Majuro, Seahorse completed 6 war patrols between January 1943 and September 1944 and sank 20 Japanese vessels totaling over 72,000 tons. Cutter's most consequential strike, however, was the night attack during Seahorse's 4th patrol in March 1944, when his boat intercepted a convoy bound for Truck Lagoon that carried aviation gasoline and aircraft parts. That convoy, 3 cargo ships escorted by 2 destroyers and representing a major slice of Truck's logistical lifeline, was sent to the bottom on March 15th, with 1 escort damaged. The loss forced Japanese commanders at Truck to scale back air operations and conserve scarce fuel and ammunition for what they assumed would be an eventual invasion that never came. American planners, committed to bypassing heavily defended positions, had decided Truck could be neutralized without a costly landing. The massive carrier raids of February and subsequent submarine interdiction had smashed Japanese air power in the Carolines and severed the supply lines needed for recovery. By mid-1944, Truck had been transformed from Japan's strongest forward base into a strategic millstone, its 40,000-man garrison cut off and largely impotent. That metamorphosis reflected the broader shift in Pacific naval warfare enabled by the Essex-class carriers. Fixed, fortified bastions and static control of key positions were being overtaken by a new style of war founded on mobility, endurance, and the projection of air power. The Americans had not merely launched superior ships. They had fashioned a new method of maritime warfare. Technical advances underpinned this change across American naval aviation. Radar and radio networks let task force commanders coordinate hundreds of aircraft over thousands of square miles. Underway replenishment techniques enabled carriers to refuel and rearm at sea from oilers and ammunition ships. Advanced bases across the Central Pacific provided staging areas for long-range missions and shelters for damaged units. Perhaps most crucial was an organizational innovation: Admiral Ernest King's alternating command system for the Pacific Fleet, which kept operations continuous while allowing one command to plan the next offensive. Under that scheme, Admiral Raymond Spruance's 5th Fleet used the carriers as Task Force 58 under Admiral Mark Mitcher, while Admiral William Bull Halsey's Third Fleet employed the same ships as Task Force 38 under Admiral William F. Halsey, Jr. This rotation let one leadership team press the fight while the other prepared future strikes. Sustaining an operational tempo Japan could not match. Japanese commanders recognized the gap but lacked the industrial base to close it. Captain Atsushi Ui, a combined fleet staff officer who had watched American operations since the war's outset, submitted a detailed analysis to the Naval General Staff in April 1944, concluding that the enemy's ability to project air power at scale had rendered Japan's fixed defenses obsolete. They wrote that American carrier groups could bring more aircraft to any point in the Central Pacific than Japan could permanently base there, and worse, those mobile air bases could be reinforced and supplied without end while Japan's fixed outposts became isolated and untenable once the enemy won local air superiority. Oi urged a radical shift. Pull the combined fleet back toward waters near the home islands where land-based air support was available and concentrate defenses around the Marianas, close enough to receive meaningful backing from Japan. That advice was only partly adopted and arrived too late to change the Central Pacific Campaign's course. The Marianas invasion in June 1944 would show the full flowering of American amphibious and carrier doctrine. Task Force 58, by then swelling to 15 fleet carriers plus 4 light carriers, backed simultaneous landings on Saipan, Guam, and Tinian while crushing the Japanese mobile fleet in the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The aerial slaughter of June 19-20, 1944, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, as American flyers called it, destroyed what remained of Japan's carrier air arm. But the root of that triumph lay in the steady, ordinary work of Essex-class decks through 1943-44, when U.S. carriers maintained unrelenting cycles of launch and recovery day and night in all weathers. That capacity to sustain a relentless tempo gave American naval aviation the decisive edge. Seaman First Class Robert Chun, a Chinese-American aircraft handler aboard USS Yorktown, knew this better than most. He had enlisted after Pearl Harbor to strike back at the forces ravaging China and labored 18-hour shifts during the Marshall Islands campaign, positioning planes for constant flight operations. Japanese pilots, Chun observed later, were courageous, perhaps braver in individual actions, but courage alone could not win when the enemy never stopped. They might attack once, maybe twice, then return to base to refuel, rearm, and wait for replacements. We kept going, Chun said. When they fled to distant anchorages, we found them. When they thought themselves safe, we struck again. That relentless pressure did more than sink ships and shoot down planes. It forced Japanese commanders to scatter their forces and keep perpetual guard, sapping defensive cohesion and preventing the massing of strength that might have slowed the American surge. The psychological blow mattered as much as the physical one. Aviators who had dominated the early war found themselves increasingly overwhelmed by American pilots in superior planes launching from platforms that weathered punishment and retaliated in turn. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's top aces, felt this shift over the Marshalls in February 1944. Although he had scored more than 60 victories early on, his encounters with F-6F Hellcats convinced him the balance had turned. Their aircraft, he wrote, were better and flown by better trained pilots in greater numbers. But what scared him most was American organization. Japanese pilots fought singly for glory. American pilots fought in teams with coordinated tactics and mutual support. You could not beat a machine with lone heroism. Sakai's insight highlighted a core element of the U.S. transformation. Technical and industrial superiority mattered, but doctrine and tactics that exploited those advantages were equally crucial. Essex Air Group under Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell exemplified this shift. McCampbell, who would become the Navy's leading ace with 34 confirmed kills, built a training regimen that prized teamwork over lone daring-do, drilling coordinated strikes so pilots learned to divide tasks and protect one another. The payoff showed repeatedly in the Central Pacific as Essex's air group outperformed Japanese opposition. "We don't train heroes," McCampbell told a war correspondent during the Marianas campaign. "We train professionals. A hero might down 2 or 3 and be killed. A professional shoots one down and comes back tomorrow, and the next day. That professional ethos permeated American carrier operations. Maintenance was standardized, so air groups could swap between ships without loss of efficiency. Logistics were designed for endurance rather than maximum short-term capacity, so operations could be sustained under harsh conditions. And planners expected campaigns to last weeks or months, not hours or days. By contrast, Japanese carrier strategy was built around concentrating all forces into a single decisive battle. That approach had worked when Japan held early technical and tactical advantages, but it faltered as American capacity grew and Japanese resources shrank. The Japanese fleet that met Task Force 58 in the Philippine Sea in June 1944, Admiral Jisaburo, Ozawa's mobile force of 9 carriers with roughly 430 aircraft, looked formidable by older metrics. Yet its air crews were mostly green after truncated training. Its carriers carried reduced ammo and fuel loads, and its logistics were fraying. When Ozawa launched on June 19, 1944, the result was ruin. Radar-guided American Hellcats, coordinated by veteran fighter directors, intercepted and shredded Japanese formations, downing over 300 aircraft while losing fewer than 30. A lopsided disaster the Americans called the Turkey Shoot. Beyond the aerial massacre, Task Force 58's endurance let it pursue counterstrikes as Ozawa withdrew. American dive bombers, torpedo planes, and submarines sank and crippled several Japanese carriers, including Taiho, Hio, and Shokaku. That day highlighted another American: innovation, tight coordination between surface forces and submarines, enabled by continuous communications that let carriers share contact reports with submarines to concentrate attacks. The submarine USS Albacore, operating east of the Marianas under Lieutenant Commander James Blanchard, received Task Force 58 intelligence about Ozawa's approach and exemplified this new, integrated form of warfare. When Japanese carriers drew into torpedo range, Lieutenant Commander James Blanchard was already in position. His strike on the carrier Taiho, then Japan's newest and largest fleet carrier, led to the ship's catastrophic loss and the deaths of more than 1,600 sailors and aviators. "The carrier boys told us where to look and we did the rest," Blanchard reported to Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of Pacific Fleet submarines. "It was like hunting with a guide who could see the whole forest from the air. We couldn't miss." That close coordination between carrier reconnaissance and submarine attack marked a revolution in maritime warfare that Japan could not duplicate. Japanese submarines, designed mainly to engage enemy warships, lacked the endurance and support to operate persistently in waters dominated by the enemy, and Japan's carrier-centered air doctrine could not supply the continuous scouting and communications that effective submarine campaigns required. The cumulative weight of American advantages became unmistakable as Task Force 58 pushed ever closer to the Japanese home islands. Seizing bases in the Marianas had not only put B-29 superfortress bombers within range of Japan, but also allowed Essex-class carriers to operate in waters once considered the inner sanctum of Japanese defense. Raids on Tokyo and other cities in February-March 1945 showed how fully naval warfare had been transformed. Carriers launching strikes from within 200 miles of the coast attacked aircraft factories, naval facilities, and transport hubs, sustaining operations for days despite attacks from land-based aircraft and kamikaze units. Aviation radio man, second-class Peter Kowalski, aboard USS Hancock during those raids, had joined the Navy in 1943 and by early 1945 had watched American naval air power evolve from a force struggling for survival into the dominant instrument of war. "They threw everything at us, kamikazes, conventional bombers, fighters, but it didn't matter," Kowalski later recalled. "We had so many ships and planes we could absorb the hits and keep going. They'd strike once or twice and think they'd done damage. 20 minutes later, we had replacement aircraft aloft and counterstrikes headed to their bases. That capacity to endure and to replenish under fire was perhaps the Essex-class carrier's defining trait. Robust damage control systems and the redundancy of task force organization let American operations continue even after severe hits. When USS Franklin was nearly destroyed by a Japanese strike in March 1945, killing more than 700 crewmen, survivors fought the fires and saved the ship. More important operationally, the temporary loss of one carrier did not cripple Task Force 58, which pressed on with its remaining carriers. Japan had no comparable resilience. The sinking of Shokaku in June 1944 by an American submarine removed not only a vessel, but a large slice of the mobile fleet's remaining striking power. Japanese carriers could not be replaced quickly, nor could veteran crews be retrained at the pace required. Each loss was essentially permanent, while American shipyards and training programs rapidly restored lost capability. That gap in sustainability proved decisive as Japan resorted to kamikaze tactics in 1945, hoping to inflict losses the U.S. could not bear, only to find that American industrial strength and organizational efficiency had produced a kind of sea power that could not be stopped by desperation alone, the ultimate. Proof of this industrial and operational supremacy came at Okinawa in April 1945. Where Task Force 58 supported nearly 3 months of continuous air operations during the longest and bloodiest amphibious campaign of the Pacific War. Despite withering kamikaze assaults, the carriers never ceased their cycle of launch and recovery, providing close air support for ground forces while striking targets across the Japanese home islands. Commander Mitsu Fukuya, who had planned the Pearl Harbor air attack and later served on the combined fleet staff in Tokyo, observed these operations and in a final report acknowledged the shift. "The enemy has created a form of sea power that we cannot counter with our remaining forces," he wrote. "Their carriers operate without pause, their aircraft attack relentlessly, and their fleet can absorb damage that would destroy any similar Japanese formation. We began this war believing spirit and skill could overcome material disadvantage. We have learned that industrial capacity and organizational efficiency are more decisive than courage or tactical brilliance. Those conclusions were backed by grim numbers. By war's end, American submarines had sunk some 1,314 Japanese naval vessels and roughly 3,580 merchant ships, totaling more than 53 million tons of shipping. Carrier aircraft destroyed thousands of Japanese planes and hundreds of ships while supporting amphibious operations that seized every major Japanese position in the Central Pacific. Essex-class carriers steamed more than 300,000 miles in combat service, launched over 100,000 combat sorties, and no Essex-class carrier was lost to enemy action. The human toll of this transformation was immense on both sides. More than 36,000 American sailors, Marines and soldiers died in the Central Pacific campaign, while Japanese military and civilian casualties exceeded 300,000. The industrial devastation brought to Japan by American bombing, enabled by bases taken during the island-hopping advance, helped force the emperor's decision to surrender. Beyond the immediate winners and losers, the Central Pacific Campaign revealed a new style of warfare that would shape military thought for the rest of the 20th century. The fusion of air power, mobility, and advanced systems produced capabilities that outstripped older measures of naval strength. The Essex-class carriers and the combined fleets built around them were more than tactical novelties. They embodied a strategic revolution that altered the global balance. When USS Essex steamed into Tokyo Bay in September 1945 for the surrender, Aviation Ordnance Man, First Class, Tommy McKenna stood again on the deck where his service had begun nearly 2 years earlier. The planes were parked for ceremony rather than combat, their wings furled and propellers still. Yet he could still feel the ship's engines humming underfoot and knew the capacities proven in the Central Pacific would persist after the war. "We had built something new," McKenna later told his family, "an approach to fighting rather than merely new vessels or aircraft. The Japanese discovered too late that the sea had become effectively American-controlled and that carriers were the instruments of that control." The doctrines and technologies pioneered during those campaigns would echo for decades. The nuclear-powered carriers of the Cold War traced their lineage to the Essex-class, inheriting the same emphasis on endurance and worldwide reach that had been decisive against Japan. The integration of sea and air power, perfected between 1943 and 1945, became the backbone of U.S. naval strategy well into the future. Yet the campaign's deepest lesson was organizational, rather than purely technical. American success rested not only on superior ships and pilots, but on an adaptable learning system that improved under combat stress. The real strength of the Essex-class force lay in its place within a larger ecosystem of submarines, amphibious units, forward bases, and an industrial base capable of sustaining operations indefinitely. Japan, brave and tactically proficient though its forces often were, never created a comparable system. Its strategy remained wedded to the decisive battle model, deliver one crushing blow and end the campaign, which failed once Americans demonstrated they could absorb such blows and keep fighting. This failure reflected a wider divergence in strategic outlook. U.S. planners, shaped by industrial-era warfare, organized for prolonged operations under strain, while Japanese planners, shaped by prior conflicts against less resourced foes, optimized for short, conclusive campaigns that assumed losses could not be rapidly replaced. The Central Pacific Campaign showed which approach matched modern warfare's realities. The Essex-class carriers and the doctrines around them produced a naval power both devastating in immediate effect and sustainable over time, a combination that proved decisive in the Pacific and in the global contests that followed. The campaign's legacy went far beyond battlefield results. The ability to project air power globally from mobile platforms influenced the post-war international order and emerged as a central element of Cold War strategy. The amphibious techniques refined during island hopping informed operations from Korea to the Persian Gulf, and the model of integrating technology, logistics, and human organization set a template for military innovation in the modern age. As the Pacific War wound down in summer 1945, the sailors and airmen of the Essex carriers could claim pride not only in defeating a powerful adversary, but in helping create a new form of warfare that would shape military affairs for generations. The flight decks that never slept had awakened a giant whose mastery of technology, organization, and continuous operational capability defined the future of naval power. Task Force 58 inscribed its place in history not through a single dramatic encounter, but through the steady accumulation of thousands of routine sorties executed with professional skill under extreme conditions. Each launch, each recovery, each combat mission combined to prove that the sea had become a highway rather than a barrier, and that whoever controlled those maritime arteries could project force anywhere. The heavy price paid in the Central Pacific between 1943 and 1945 taught every major power enduring lessons about strategy and resources. The flight decks that never slept had truly altered the world, and the consequences of that shift outlived the last veterans of the conflict. On the morning of September 2, 1945, USS Essex lay anchored in Tokyo Bay with her deck cleared for the surrender rights that ended the Pacific War. But for those who had served aboard her and sister ships, the decisive achievement had been the relentless, everyday work that transformed American naval aviation from a defensive force into the most potent instrument of war then known. They had created something unprecedented, and in doing so, they changed the character of warfare itself, building capabilities that would shape military affairs for generations.